Imagine this. You've just moved into a new neighborhood, excited to settle in, when suddenly, the police show up at your doorstep. Not because you called them, but because someone else did. That's exactly what happened to one black man just trying to move into his home. His white neighbor, seeing a stranger outside, assumed the worst and called 911. Officers arrived, ready to investigate, until they realized who he was. The man at the center of it all wasn't just a new resident. He was the city's brand new police chief. What happened next left everyone stunned, especially the neighbor who made the call. Was it an honest mistake or something deeper? And how did the chief respond in that tense moment? This story is about more than just one misunderstanding. It's about assumptions, bias, and a lesson that no one in that neighborhood will ever forget. Stay tuned to see how it all unfolded. As the officers stepped out of their patrol car, the new police chief stood calmly, watching the scene unfold. He had seen situations like this before, but never from this side. Dressed in plain clothes after a long day at work, he didn't look like what his neighbor expected. The woman who made the call peeked out from behind her curtain, still unaware of the truth. The officers approached cautiously, their hands near their belts, ready for anything. "Sir, can we ask what you're doing here?" one of them asked. The chief took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "I live here," he said, his voice even. "I just moved in." The officers exchanged glances. Something about him seemed familiar, but they weren't sure why. Meanwhile, the neighbor watched nervously, waiting for what she assumed would be an arrest. But she was about to get a reality check she never saw coming. One of the officers took a closer look at the man in front of him. There was something familiar about his face, but it wasn't clicking yet. "Do you have any ID on you?" the officer asked, his tone firm but not aggressive. The man reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He knew the drill. As he handed over his ID, the officer's expression shifted. His eyes flicked between the name on the card and the man standing before him. Meanwhile, the neighbor, still peering through her window, felt a sense of satisfaction. She had done her part, she thought, keeping the neighborhood safe. But safe from what? A man carrying boxes into his own home. She hadn't thought that far ahead. Back outside, the realization hit the officer like a wave. "Wait a second," he muttered. His partner leaned over to see, eyebrows raised. Then, the moment of truth arrived. "Chief." The word hung in the air, thick with tension. The moment the officer said it, silence filled the air. His partner stiffened, realizing a mistake unfolding right in front of them. The man they had been questioning, the man their department had just sworn in, was their new boss. The chief held their gaze, his face unreadable. He had seen officers in tough situations before, but now he was watching them struggle with their own assumptions in real time. Inside the house, the neighbor's confidence started to waver. She noticed the officer's body language shift, their tension replaced with something else, something like regret. She gripped the edge of her curtain, her stomach tightening. Was something wrong? She had been so sure she was doing the right thing. But if that man was really dangerous, why weren't the officers detaining him? One officer finally cleared his throat. "Chief, we didn't realize." But the chief didn't let him finish. Instead, he folded his arms, waiting. The real test wasn't over yet. The officers stood frozen, unsure of what to say next. The chief didn't look angry, just disappointed. And somehow, that made it worse. His silence was heavier than words, forcing them to sit with the weight of their mistake. But just as one officer opened his mouth to speak, another voice cut through the night. "I called them," the neighbor announced, stepping onto her porch. Her arms were crossed, but her confidence had faded. She looked between the chief and the officers, her face tight with confusion. "I thought something was wrong." Her voice wavered slightly, as if she was starting to doubt herself. The chief turned toward her, studying the woman who had brought the police to his doorstep. "And what exactly did you think was wrong?" he asked. His tone wasn't angry, just measured. But before she could answer, another voice spoke up, a deeper, unfamiliar one. He's not the only one who just moved in. Everyone turned toward the darkened house next door. A man stood in the shadows, watching. The tension in the air shifted again. This night wasn't over yet. The officers and the chief turned toward the figure in the shadows. The man stepped forward, his face now visible under the glow of a street lamp. He looked unfamiliar, tall, with a serious expression and hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "I just moved in too," he repeated, glancing between the chief and the neighbor. "Guess I should expect a visit from the police soon, huh?" The neighbor shifted uncomfortably, realizing how bad this looked. She had assumed the worst about the chief, and now a stranger was pointing it out in the clearest way possible. "That's not what this was," she insisted, her voice defensive. "I was just trying to be cautious." The chief nodded slowly, then took a step closer. "Cautious of what?" he asked. The question hung in the air. The neighbor opened her mouth but had no real answer. For the first time, she saw the situation from the outside, and it didn't look good. One of the officers cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Chief, was sorry for the misunderstanding," he said. His partner quickly echoed him. The chief let out a slow breath, the frustration still visible on his face. "This isn't just about me," he finally said. "It's about what happens when people assume before they know the facts." The neighbor lowered her gaze, shame creeping in. The new man, still watching from his porch, shook his head and muttered, "Welcome to the neighborhood." And with that, the chief turned back toward his house, unlocking the door and stepping inside. Tonight had been a lesson for everyone. The neighbor stood on her porch for a long moment, watching as the chief disappeared into his home. She felt a knot in her stomach, regret, embarrassment, something she couldn't quite name. She had thought she was protecting her neighborhood, but now she realized she had only exposed her own fears. The officers gave each other a look before heading back to their car, the weight of the night settling in. They had a lot to think about too. Mistakes like this could change lives. The man next door lingered for a second, then shook his head and went inside. The street was quiet again, but it didn't feel the same. Something had shifted. Inside his house, the chief sat down, exhaling slowly. He had seen this before, too many times. But maybe this moment would make people think. Maybe next time, someone would pause before picking up the phone. Maybe.